Hello, good evening, and welcome back. Predictions from people with nothing to lose mean nothing. Like, let's say, for example, with whatever job that you might have, if you're a plumber and you do your job and yet the pipes leak, well, you're fired. You're not getting paid, or you're not going to get any more work. Well, if it's admin and the figures don't add up and you can't organise people, you're fired. Well, you're not getting any more work. If you're an accountant and yet you end up costing your client more tax than they would have done if they did it themselves, then again, you're fired. But if you're a sage advisor and you provide advice, and yes, of course, I'm looking at Neil Ferguson here, which has been incorrect by a magnitude of 6 multiple times, you get a pay rise. So, with that in mind, it's not really worth listening to people if they've got nothing to lose. So they put themselves out there and make these audacious claims and, just sales and persuade the powers that be that it's worthwhile, then suddenly they get a pay rise. If it then comes out later on that they were completely wrong and had no semblance of reality whatsoever, there is no punishment for them in the slightest. In which case, that's hardly going to discourage them, because they see that they've got everything to gain and nothing to lose. So for the rest of us, it makes sense then to not listen to them. So we're talking about risk-taking, and would you like to take the risk in terms of possibly catching this new Indian variant of COVID? But we're not talking about, what is the risk for these predictions being wrong? Well, there isn't any. And that is the more important thing. And I do understand the idea of tenure, even when it comes to having scientific advisors. But nonetheless, if you've got such a shit track record, then by all means fine, don't fire them, but definitely do not give them a pay rise, and perhaps just ignore what they have to say. Maybe that'll be more worthwhile. And I do understand that a broken clock is correct twice today, so just because somebody obscure was able to guess it bang on, it does not mean that they knew what they were talking about. Obviously, that if you had 60 million people all making different predictions and just pick a different day as to when the peak would be, you're going to have hundreds of thousands of people who are correct. It doesn't mean they're a savant. It's just understandable based on chance. But given that there are no repercussions for these experts, and there's only a boon for them, then, of course, it isn't worth listening to what they have to say, because they are going to make it as disastrous as possible in order to try and prove that they're worthwhile and that they should have their job. And it's the same that goes for government as a whole. That if there's no way to get rid of somebody from their position, then they have to spend all their time making it seem as if their position and their own position in a position is worthwhile. So of course that's what government does, to try and persuade you that you need a government when you don't. And the same goes for anything that is government affiliated, whether it be SAGE to say, oh yes, well you need us because we're giving you these warnings that are accurate unless they're not. And the BBC saying, well, you need us because we're the only impartial broadcaster, even though they're not. So it's just the same thing time and time again. It's just trying to use fear with absolutely no punishment or repercussions for being incredibly wrong. So is it worth listening to them at all? No, it isn't. So why am I even covering this? For two reasons. One is to draw your attention to what I've just said, and the second is because, apparently, old Bojo isn't aware of this. Yes, for whatever bloody reason, he doesn't seem to understand how incentives, or the carrot and the stick, will affect people's actions. Shocking, I know. Prime Minister, and yet, apparently he doesn't seem to realise this. So, Boris sends army into hotspots like Bolton and Blackburn with Darwin, as he pressed ahead with indoor drinking and dining, despite Sage warning that Indian variant could realistically be 50% more infectious than Kent strain and lead to 1,000 deaths a day by summer. And they have, some very scary looking graphs, depending on how much more transmissible it is. Not necessarily more deadly, they're going to guess it's the same. How it happened in India, the 7 case rates by Bolton, but their predictions, which are comparing it to the first and second wave, as we see here, going back from, until the beginning of February, that, they're expecting the hospital admissions to be dreadful come mid-July, and the same as hospital occupancy, with around 50% more infectious than Kent strain. Depending on who you're looking at, they're trying to say mid-July, it's going to be dreadful. Daily deaths as well. Mid-July, it's going to be dreadful. And I'm thinking, hang on a moment. Just one moment, please. Why is that? Is it just July's the worst time? Or is that due to people travelling around the world more? Or is that due to people being outside? But I thought 90% humidity at 28 degrees C, the virus lasts about 30 seconds. From what I've seen. So what is this all about? Well, quite simply, it's all about fear. And I think that is how the Sage experts were able to persuade Bojo. That it wasn't saying, here is our data, and you can ignore the ones before because they were obviously wrong. But this one is definitely correct, and we know what we're talking about, despite having a track record of not knowing what we're talking about. I think instead, what they basically went with is, okay, here is something that makes it seem bad enough in order for us to be worthwhile, and now it is down to you to capitalise on this emergency, this panic, this pandemic, in order to then make it seem as if government is a useful entity. Of course, his first response could have just been shutting the border to India, but he didn't want to do that. So, again, what on earth is the government here for? But I'm going to leave it at that, because I'm sure we've all had far too much talk about COVID variants. But if there is something that you would like to add, then of course the conversation is always open down below. But more important than that, as always, have a good one.